Hi everyone. I'm going to talk about open data and external stakeholders, as well as open data and social change, but potentially from a different context than we might be used to. In one sense, the context is very narrow. The Australian government opened consultation for its data sharing and release reforms, and there was an opportunity to reflect on trends in open data and civic data sharing within this Australian context. In another sense, the context is very broad in that I'll be critiquing quite generally how open data is imagined and operationalized, but then providing some provocations towards specific policy constraints designed to meet these larger problems. As we're all learning too hard these days, nothing seems to be a panacea. But what is presented here might stir debate around how to operationalize the sharing of data for civic purposes in the future. We start with my own provocation that led to this paper, which came from thinking about open data, open government, and responding with open for what? Now that question is meant to stir the realization that opening civil data can make civic hands unclean. Our contention is that stakeholders cannot wash their hands of the data they share, and further, that novel forms of governance for these novel and novelly shared resources should be considered. To situate these contentions, we suggest that optimism in the inherent public good of open and shared data has been eroding since the early 2000s. This isn't really news. Attard et al.'s 2015 systematic look at how normative calls of transparency, value creation, and participation of open data are hindered in their operationalization, in terms of accessibility and usability, efficacy measures, and data heterogeneity grounds, as well as further kind of strung up against measures around participation in government processes itself. At the same time, there's the supply side problems around liability, competition, intellectual property regimes, and of course privacy that all give governments second thought for what to open to whom and when. Considering the for whom solicits a critique that all democracies are not equal, and that is to say that monitorial or deliberative or participatory practices of democracy require discrete designs and roles for multiple stakeholders. And this is Albert Meyer and Ruhr here from 2017. Power here, I'm arguing, needs to be taken into account, as does how the choices of political design relate to democracy in socio-material ways, including digital affordances in our networked era. So the ideal of transparency, citizen participation, and collaboration that is often assumed in data regimes interfaces politically against interwoven technical, cultural, legal, and organizational structures of what we term democracy is and should be. Context-sensitive impact needs further study for a start, and context-aware design needs to be baked into practices and plans of opening data. Backing up a conceptual review of open government policies to the 1950s in the U.S. One might speculate that these were specifically aligned as a kind of capitalist democratic good in opposition to the Soviet Union's information control systems of censorship and propaganda. And one could argue, that this could take that stream all the way to Hayek, right, about the kind of merits of decentralized information and how it lets markets price things and how or not this reconciles with civic society or civic duty, and we'll only note that in our 10 minutes here. Instead, what I want to focus on is that in our current datafied world, data is a resource to be exploited. We think here of data as the new oil, data to be mined, etc., is facing new types of criticism. The mere fact that data exists, whether openly or not, opens the door for data to be understood as a liability. We can imagine this through maladministration or hacking, or usually both, or even a kind of cultural wokeness, such as that which comes from Lemov. Lemov's critique that data isn't a resource, but that data is people, right? That there's these kind of other critical reconfigurations of humans' relations to their data. And all this is to say that in the current environment, the mere existence of data stores, released, shared, or kept secret, can be as much of a liability as an asset on the balance sheet of any public or private organization. And alternatively, these stores might be interpreted by the public differently than the resource, than a resource for economic or social growth. So the worst case example, of course, in the private sector we can look to is Equifax, which is well known, as is the radical openness of WikiLeaks. But in the Australian context in particular, Australians are familiar with a long list of lackluster data policies and blunders from our own federal government. These are, sadly, now being infused into debates around the COVID tracking app, and are directly traceable to blunders that include releasing public transit ride data that could identify certain types of people, making digital medical records too open, quite frankly, maladministration of our census, very recently, a lack of privacy for immigrant individuals' work histories, and something called the robo-debt scandal that literally is as awful as you've seen repeat on the screen there. Empirical cases such as these falsify again and again the inherent good of ever more data. Instead, we have learned that if data is defined as a resource, it can be and will be exploited in all senses of the term. So openness means, therefore, that regardless of the intentions of the data distributors, or what the Australian government calls accredited custodians, there are generative capacities of data that are unforeseen, but follow contextual logics extant in the community, as well as contextual logics found outside of that community. So capacity to re-identify or data or its use in aggregate, right, for future discriminatory scenarios only increases with every additional data set that becomes available. There is no delete key, there is no undo. And with divergent and variable data literacies across populations, issues of social stratification are as ripe to be entrenched as they are to be ameliorated through opening data for civic practice. The lack of specific awareness of some individuals about what data exists about them, or how it is used, or how it can be used in the future is just not really solvable merely through critiques of operationalization, think here accessibility and literacies, or democratic participation design. The point is that actors' context and their mediation through digital technologies can be extraneous to the civic logics that turns open data into public good. So from this review of how society puts data to use and how data is used by society, we were able to craft some responses specified to the Australian context of data sharing and release reforms, but which might be applicable to provoking a review of open data regimes elsewhere. First is acknowledging a binary of open and shut does not make sense, and institutionalizing the governance of a resulting sharing spectrum. How, when, and with whom data is shared matters. To operationalize civic goals within a spectrum of data sharing practices, we propose cryptographic data sharing agreements, DSAs, to effectively, efficiently, and democratically govern public data goods. DSAs should, like Creative Commons licensing, be articulated on three levels: a human readable level for the layperson, the lawyer level for legal context, and a machine readable level to enable automated data management in line with the other two goals. These allow computationally enforced governance of how attached data content can be utilized. One might turn to encryption and or digital rights management for those instances where DSA promotes specific ways of sharing versus public release. Like Creative Commons, there will be a need for an assortment of capacities and constraints available to resource holders. Further, any data product made via a DSA should carry forward its DSA license as part of that product. The publication of DSA should be required to record any uses or modifications, is an example, with combination of other data sets of relevant data that creates, of course, new data. And although I'm loath to suggest it, and it bears repeating that I'm loath to suggest it, implementations of DSAs could benefit from each DSA's computer readable layer being cryptographically unique as they are issued to organizations, with any uses and modifications noted on a distributed ledger. As partners' data use evolves, so too must their disclosure of that use. This is meant to enable utilization of public resources by both public and private actors to be accounted for and visible for scrutiny. Such a system would enable and enforce auditing forensics, and DSAs should also be versioned and time-stamped to include both their origins and transactions between parties, including information about when and how data added to products was obtained both by the issuer of the DSA and by those that obtain data from other sources, open or not. Apart from tracking, active speculation of worst case scenarios should be inbuilt to any data sharing projects. Data are generative, and we should assume they can and will be used in ways unintended by the actor or the project or the public seeking benefit. This means evaluation efforts need to focus substantively on the exceptions of intended use as opposed to intended use, that which happens outside the appropriate and advertised uses of specific data sets. We suggest employing models similar to those used by security researchers to evaluate risk and impact. Often there's a model of penetration testing to evaluate risks of systems, which we think creates a useful parallel for sharing data through inequity testing methodologies. Whether here's a slide. Whether this means privacy bounties or prizes or other incentives, we should welcome hacking the data darkly for public good and institutionalize these practices. This is civic QA at social scale. These activities have the capacity to make unintended consequences of data applications and services that may reinforce existing social inequalities or create new forms of social exclusion more visible, and offers a preemptive or preventative measures or space to carry those out. Just quickly as my time runs through, we need to rethink consent. It is our opinion that consent is untenable considering the generative nature of data use over time and space, meaning that citizens and public institutions cannot consent to every conceivable permutation and combination of their data, and thus we should not pretend anyone has the agency to do so. What does this mean for sharing practices when we must treat each data product as if consent was not given by those whose data went into it? Well, there's ideas like differential privacy, right, to kind of decrease the fidelity a bit. In the Australian context, national security loopholes exist in issues of consent that are specifically worrisome, just compared to the otherwise progressive directions that the data sharing reforms are going. And I guess just quite quickly, one final point. Australia suffers acutely from the kind of arguments that suggest clouds and sovereignty are, in combination, are trying to combine that idea, remain quite ill-considered. And I don't think we're alone in this, but Australia as the island nation, resorting to clouds elsewhere, definitely has some catching up to do. So, together, I don't really have a policy suggestion for that other than build it here. So, together, these considerations around why open data is not an open and shut case stem from the specific jurisdiction and political context of Australia, but speak to ways in which we will need to reconsider the larger challenges met when data is, on the one hand, amorphously open, and on the other, meets quite discrete stakeholder units and heterogeneous registers of social change in the real world. So thank you very much for your time and considering my talk, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. I should give a shout out to my colleagues, Lexia Maddox and Robbie Fordyce, who helped put together some of the ideas in this presentation as well. So yeah, thanks everyone. Goodbye.